A very simple question. In the age when Jesus was born, what was the largest city in the world? The answer seems almost certain. Rome. Yes, every history book and documentary you have ever seen tells the same story. In that era, Rome was rising from republic to empire at the height of its power. The city had a population of 1 million. It had aqueducts, broad roads, and all kinds of monumental architecture. It was the summit of human civilization. Could there possibly be another answer? Yes. The answer is Chang'an. In a sense, the idea that Rome was number one in the world has become an outdated story. Over the past few decades, archaeologists have carried out extensive work on the ruins of an ancient city northwest of today's Xi'an, China. Their discoveries have completely rewritten the argument over which city was truly the largest in the world around the year AD 1. Rome was not the largest city in the world at that time. Chang'an was. Not one of the largest, the largest. How is that possible? First, we need to define what we mean by largest. If we are comparing the area enclosed by city walls, Chang'an has almost no rival. The area inside its walls was 36 square kilometers, nearly 3 times larger than the walled area of Rome. But that is not the point we are debating today. After all, anyone could build a huge wall in the desert and then declare it the largest city in the world. That would be meaningless. What we are comparing today is what really matters: population and prosperity. The greatness of a city depends on how many people it can feed, how much wealth it can create, and how complex a system it can keep running. On this point, the traditional view says Rome wins decisively. Because Rome supposedly had 1 million people, while Chang'an appears to have had only a little over 200,000. But the story is nowhere near that simple. In fact, when you truly walk into the ruins of Chang'an and carefully consider the archaeological discoveries of recent years, you will find that they point to a completely different truth. And that truth is made up of 3 secrets you have probably never heard before. The first secret. Inside the walls of Chang'an, at least half the population was hidden. They did not appear in any household register, but they really existed. The second secret. Around the walls of Chang'an, there once existed an entire network of satellite cities, created by imperial mausoleums. Together, their population was larger than that of the city of Rome itself. The third secret concerns a royal estate 70 times larger than the entire city of Rome. It was not a garden. It was a massive wealth-producing machine, constantly feeding resources into the capital. These 3 secrets will completely overturn everything you thought you knew about the greatest city in the world. According to Han Dynasty historical records, in AD 2, Chang'an County had 80,800 households and 246,200 people. This is a number that has been cited again and again. It is also the central piece of evidence behind the traditional argument that Rome was far larger than Chang'an. For Rome in the same period, population estimates vary among scholars. Glenn Story proposed a lower estimate of about 450,000, while mainstream studies, such as the Cambridge Ancient History, generally accept a range of 800,000 to 1 million. Looking only at the numbers on paper, Chang'an does seem to have had only 1/4 to 1/2 of Rome's population. But there is one spatial fact that must be established first. The area inside Chang'an's walls was 36 square kilometers, while the area inside Rome's walls in the age of Augustus was about 13 square kilometers. Chang'an was 2.8 times larger than Rome. If one city was nearly 3 times larger in area, but had only 1/4 of the registered population, that would mean the population density inside Chang'an was only about 1/10 that of Rome. How do we explain such a huge difference in density? Is there a problem with a figure of 246,200 people? The Han population registration system was based on registered commoner households. Only ordinary people included in the local government household registers were counted. But the Han Dynasty also had another separate system, the palace register. This was under the authority of the Shaofu, the imperial household treasury, and was used specifically to register personnel serving inside the palace. These two systems did not overlap. Palace-registered personnel would never appear in the local government household registers. The population figure for Chang'an County, therefore, counted registered commoners under the jurisdiction of the Jingzhou governor. It did not count every actual human being living within the territory of Chang'an County. Once this point is clear, we can break down the real population inside Chang'an County layer by layer. The first layer was the population of the commoner districts inside the city walls. The space inside the walls of Chang'an was divided by a grid of streets into 11 functional zones. Based on textual sources and the field work carried out continuously by the Institute of Archaeology at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences since the 1950s, the number of residential wards inside the walls has ultimately been identified as 160. These wards were the basic residential units for urban commoners in the Han Dynasty. They can be understood as enclosed neighborhoods with walls and controlled gates. Although no single source gives a unified standard for the maximum number of households in one ward, the basic upper limit was around 100 households. Several excavated ward sites in Han Chang'an also support an estimated range of about 50 to 100 households per ward. Using the Han historical average of 4.5 people per household, the upper limit for the registered population inside the city would be about 72,000. The real number was probably lower, because not every ward was operating at full capacity. In addition to ordinary commoners living in the wards, there were also jiadi inside the walls, the grand residences of high officials and nobles. These mansions occupied enormous plots of land and were not comparable to ordinary wards. Their population density was much lower. A single noble residence might contain dozens or even more than 100 people, including the master, family members, servants, slaves and retainers. But the total number of such residences was limited. Based on the number of building foundations found within the surveyed area, the total number of elite households in Chang'an was probably only in the hundreds. Even by a generous estimate, the population of the elite residential districts would have been unlikely to exceed 10,000. Therefore, the total population of commoners and nobles inside the city walls was probably no more than 80,000. The second layer was the population of the nearby suburbs outside the walls. This group has long been overlooked. What the Book of Han records is not the population inside the city of Chang'an, but the total population of the county-level administrative unit called Chang'an County. The administrative territory of Chang'an County was larger than the area enclosed by the city walls. Historical sources record that there were 6 townships around Chang'an. In the Western Han, the number of households in a township varied greatly, usually ranging from 1,500 to several thousand households. The 6 suburban townships around Chang'an should have belonged to a relatively densely populated area. If we estimate an average of 5,000 households per township, With 4.5 people per household, we get 135,000 people. Added to the roughly 80,000 inside the city, the total exceeds 200,000, which fits fairly well with a recorded figure of 246,000 people for Chang'an County. Archaeological discoveries also confirm the scale of population in the suburbs of Chang'an. In 2025, the Shanxi Academy of Archaeology discovered a large Western Han settlement site about 600 meters outside the eastern wall of Han Chang'an. The site yielded numerous building foundations, wells, ash pits, road remains, and craft production remains, including pottery kilns and evidence related to iron casting and coin casting. The site covered a broad area and lasted throughout the entire Western Han period. Archaeologists identified it as a suburban residential and craft production area dependent on the city of Chang'an. Similar sites have also been found sporadically outside the northern and western walls of Chang'an, though they have not yet been exposed on a large scale. These discoveries directly prove that large population settlements did exist outside the city walls. The third layer, and the most crucial one, was the non-registered population inside the palace districts within the city walls. More than two-thirds of the area inside Chang'an's walls was occupied by palace complexes. Weiyang Palace covered about 4.8 square kilometers. The Shanglin Palace site was even larger, generally believed to have covered between 5.5 and 6 square kilometers. In addition, there were Gui Palace, North Palace, and Mingguang Palace. The total area of these 5 major palace complexes alone exceeded 16 square kilometers. How much manpower was needed to keep such enormous palace complexes operating day after day? This can only be estimated through institutional texts and comparison with similar courts. The Han Old Regulations record that the number of government slaves in the Western Han court was counted in the tens of thousands. These government slaves referred to the families of criminals or prisoners of war who had been confiscated into palace service and were assigned to heavy labor. During the reign of Emperor Wu, the number of palace women under the control of the Yeting, the bureau in charge of the inner palace, alone reached several thousand. As for guards, the Han Dynasty's southern and northern armies, along with palace guard units such as the Qimen and Yulin, had a combined strength of tens of thousands. A considerable portion of them were stationed in or rotated through the palace areas. There were also numerous officials, attendants, craftsmen, and service workers operating in shifts day and night. When all these categories are added together, the most cautious estimates suggest that Weiyang Palace and Shanglin Palace alone required at least 30,000 people simply to maintain basic operations. If all 5 major palaces and the other official facilities inside the city are included, a conservative estimate of 50,000 to 100,000 people is relatively reasonable. The vast majority of these people belong to the palace register under the Shaofu. They were completely outside the household registration statistics of the local government. In other words, none of them were included in the figure of 246,200 people recorded in the geography section of the Book of Han. Let us summarize. Inside the walls of Chang'an, there were about 80,000 commoners and nobles. In the 6 suburban townships outside the walls, there were at least about 135,000 people. Together, they made up more than 200,000 registered commoners, which is not far from the recorded figure of 246,000. This shows that if we exclude the palace population, the low estimate for commoners inside the city plus residents in the suburbs does indeed come close to the textual number. But that is precisely the point. The figure of 246,000 cannot have included the palace population. If we add the non-registered population of the palace districts, then the actual population carried by Chang'an County was over 400,000. Compared with Rome, Chang'an County's actual population of 400,000 already approaches Rome's low estimate of 450,000. But this is still only the data for one county. If we expand our view to the mausoleum cities around Chang'an, the satellite cities created by imperial tombs, located several dozen kilometers from the walls of Chang'an, then the total population of the greater Chang'an metropolitan region enters an entirely different order of magnitude. And that is what the next secret reveals. We have just discussed how the actual population carried by Chang'an County was conservatively over 450,000. If the calculations stopped there, Chang'an still could not compete in total population with a mainstream estimate for Rome, 800,000 to 1 million. But the special nature of Chang'an lies in the fact that it was not an isolated city. Beyond the walls of Chang'an, along the Xianyang Plateau on the northern bank of the Wei River, there stood a series of complete cities created by imperial mausoleums. In the Han Dynasty, these were called Lingyi, mausoleum cities. The origins of the mausoleum city system can be traced back to the founding period of the Western Han. After Liu Bang, Emperor Gaozu of Han established his capital at Chang'an, he adopted the advice of his ministers in order to keep the old aristocracies of the former 6 states under control. The Tian clan of Qi, the Zhao, Chu, and Jing clans of Chu, the descendants of the former states of Yan, Zhao, Han, and Wei, and powerful local families from across the empire were all moved into the Guangdong region. In ordinary times, they could strengthen the area around the capital and help defend against the Xiongnu. If the eastern regional powers rebelled, these people could also be organized for campaigns to the east. This was a strategy of strengthening the root and weakening the branches. But where were these migrants settled? Not inside the city of Chang'an. There was simply not enough space inside the walls. Instead, they were settled beside the mausoleum Liu Bang had prepared for himself in advance. That mausoleum was Shanglin, and the city that housed the migrants was Changlingyi, the Changling mausoleum city. This was the beginning of the mausoleum city system. From Emperor Gaozu's Changling onward, later Western Han emperors continued the practice. It is important to emphasize that these mausoleum cities were fundamentally different from the burial zones outside Rome. Along the Via Appia outside Rome, there were indeed aristocratic tombs and columbaria, but those were burial areas, places for the dead. Western Han mausoleum cities were cities for the living. They had their own walls, complete municipal facilities, independent administration, and populations ranging from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. The Book of Han gives explicit population data for 2 of them. Changlingyi had about 50,000 households and 180,000 people. Maolingyi had about 61,000 households and more than 277,000 people. The population of Maolingyi was more than 30,000 higher than the registered population of the capital Chang'an itself. A city built around an emperor's mausoleum had more people than the imperial capital. Nothing like this could have existed in the burial belts outside any Roman city. Archaeology provides physical evidence for these textual figures. Take Yanglingyi, the mausoleum city of Emperor Jing of Han, as an example. Archaeological survey shows that it was 4,500 meters from east to west and 1,000 meters from north to south, covering about 4.5 square kilometers. Maolingyi, the mausoleum city of Emperor Wu of Han, had a perimeter of 11,190 meters and covered about 5.5 square kilometers. This was a real city. It had walls, streets, drainage systems and markets. At the Maolingyi site, archaeologists discovered building remains, pentagonal water channels, pebble-paved roads and other municipal facilities. These show that it was not a dependent village, but a city with complete urban functions. The composition of the mausoleum city population also changed significantly over time. In the early period, the residents were mainly Eastern aristocrats forcibly relocated to Guangzhong. By the time of Emperor Wu, the threshold for relocation had been raised dramatically. Only wealthy families with assets of 3 million cash or more were qualified to be moved into Maolingyi. This means that those relocated into Maolingyi were not ordinary peasants. They were among the richest people in the entire empire. They brought wealth, craftsmen, commercial networks, and cultural traditions into Guangzhong, making the mausoleum cities not only population centers, but also centers of economy and culture. Many of the most famous scholars and cultural figures of the Western Han left traces of their lives in these mausoleum cities. It can be said that the mausoleum cities gathered the empire's highest concentration of wealth and intellectual resources. In total, the Western Han built 7 mausoleum cities around Chang'an. Converted into modern units, their distances from Chang'an were as follows. Changlingyi was about 21 kilometers from Chang'an, Anlingyi about 15 kilometers, Yanglingyi about 19 kilometers, Maolingyi about 33 kilometers, and Pinglingyi about 29 kilometers. The remaining mausoleum cities were distributed in similar zones, all concentrated northeast to northwest of Chang'an within a radius of roughly 15 to 35 kilometers. These 7 mausoleum cities lined up along the Xianyang Plateau on the northern bank of the Wei River, stretching about 45 kilometers from east to west. Together with Chang'an, they formed a tightly connected urban cluster. According to textual sources and estimates by modern scholars, the total population of the 7 mausoleum cities was more than 750,000. Under higher estimates, the total population of the mausoleum cities at the end of the Western Han may have exceeded 1.2 million. Beyond the mausoleum cities, there was an even broader administrative framework. In the Guangzhong region around Chang'an, the Western Han established Jingzhaoyin, Zuofengyi, and Yufufeng, collectively known as the 3 capital districts, or Sanfu. They formed the direct administrative region of the capital. The Book of Han records the household and population figures for the Sanfu in AD 2 as follows. Jingzhaoyin had 195,702 households and 682,468 people. Zuofengyi had 235,101 households and 917,822 people. Yufufeng had 216,377 households and 836,070 people. Together, the 3 capital districts had 647,180 households and a population of 2,436,360. These 2.43 million people form the administrative foundation of the Greater Chang'an metropolitan region. The population of Chang'an County and the 7 mausoleum cities was nested within this framework, forming a complete imperial capital region system. Now, let us examine the population of Han Chang'an using the standard commonly applied to modern metropolitan areas. A city-centered radius of 50 kilometers. Within 50 kilometers of Chang'an were Chang'an County itself, with 450,000 to 500,000 people. The 7 Mausoleum cities, with more than 750,000 people, and a large number of village and township residents scattered throughout the Sanfu region. Taking all the data together, the total population within a 50-kilometer radius of the Western Han capital region can be conservatively estimated at between 1.2 million and 1.6 million. Now look at Rome. Within 50 kilometers of Rome, there was no network of large-scale satellite cities comparable to the Western Han Mausoleum cities. The towns around Rome, such as Fidenae, covering about 50 hectares, Gabii, about 54 hectares, and Crustumerium, about 60 hectares, were extremely small, with population densities far below that of Rome itself. Even including the port of Ostia, scholars estimate the total population of Rome and its surrounding 50-kilometer region at about 1.2 million to 1.5 million. In other words, if we calculate total metropolitan population within a 50-kilometer radius, Han, Chang'an and Rome were roughly in the same league. Both were at the level of 1.2 million to 1.6 million people. But their internal structures were completely different. Rome's population was highly concentrated in a single urban core. 1 million people were compressed within 13 square kilometers inside the walls, stacked vertically in multi-story apartment blocks known as insulae. Han Chang'an's population, by contrast, was institutionally dispersed between the city of Chang'an and the 7 Mausoleum cities, forming a multi-nodal layout spread horizontally across space. Rome was a single-core megacity. Han Chang'an was a multi-core metropolitan region. Each model had its strengths and weaknesses. But in the contest over the greatest city in the world, the total population of the Han Chang'an metropolitan region within a 50-kilometer radius was in no way inferior to Rome's, and may even have slightly exceeded the upper range of Rome's mainstream estimates. At this point, we have completed the full picture of Han Chang'an's population. The registered population of Chang'an County, 246,000, was only the tip of the iceberg. The suburban township residents outside the walls, the non-registered palace population inside the walls, and the hundreds of thousands of residents in the 7 surrounding mausoleum cities. These 3 overlooked groups pushed the total population of the Chang'an metropolitan region above 1.2 million. But where did the grain and wealth needed to support such a population come from? The next secret points to a place 70 times larger than the city of Rome. Urban scale inevitably raises an unavoidable question. How were more than 1 million people fed? Rome's model was one of extreme external dependence. The city's grain supply relied mainly on maritime transport. Grain from Sicily, Sardinia, North Africa and Egypt entered the Tiber through the ports of Ostia and Portus, then was carried upriver into Rome. This supply chain was extremely fragile. In AD 62, a storm at the port of Ostia destroyed nearly 200 grain ships. A single natural disaster was enough to plunge a capital of 1 million people into famine. Chang'an had no Mediterranean Sea. It was deep inland, more than 1,000 kilometers from the nearest coastline. So what did the Han Empire rely on to support this vast metropolitan region? The answer was a tract of land dozens of times larger than the city of Rome. Shanglin Park. How large was the expanded Shanglin Park? Ancient texts preserve several different figures for the size of Shanglin Park. But even by the most conservative estimate, its area was at the level of 1,000 square kilometers. Compared with the city of Rome, Shanglin Park was 77 times larger. Now compare it with Versailles. Today, the grounds of the Palace of Versailles cover about 8 square kilometers. Before the French Revolution, the Greater Park covered about 80 square kilometers. Shanglin Park was 12 to 37 times larger than the Great Park of Versailles. Compared with the Persian Royal Garden at Pasargadae, which covered only about 1.6 square kilometers, Shanglin Park was more than 600 times larger. In other words, this one royal park was larger than all the privately held land owned by the British royal family today. But the numbers are only the beginning. What truly distinguished Shanglin Park from any other royal garden in the world was its nature. Rome also had royal and aristocratic gardens, such as the gardens of Lucullus and the gardens of Maecenas. But these were landscaped spaces for elite leisure. Medieval European royal hunting parks, such as Windsor Great Park in England, could also be substantial in size, but their functions were limited to hunting and recreation. Shanglin Park was something entirely different. The table of high officials in the Book of Han provides a stunning list. The administrative agencies of Shanglin Park oversaw park management, material allocation, palace supply, horticulture, boats, coin casting, handicraft production, livestock breeding, copper inspection, hydraulic works, agriculture, and granaries. This was not a garden office. It was a complete, state-run economic complex. The wealth of Shanglin Park was so vast that it required an independent bureaucratic system to operate. So what exactly was inside Shanglin Park? First, agriculture and horticulture. Historical records state that when Emperor Wu first developed Shanglin Park, more than 3,000 varieties of rare flowers and fruits from across the empire were transplanted there. This was not merely the emperor's private botanical garden. It was the empire's agricultural testing ground. Crops from different climate zones were brought into Guangdong, tested, domesticated, and selected. Successful varieties could then be promoted to other parts of the empire. Then there was animal husbandry. Shanglin Park raised all kinds of beasts. These animals served ritual and palace supply needs. According to records, deer alone were needed for sacrifices at a rate of 1,000 hides per year. There were also cases of licensed monopoly products. Under Han regulations, when regional kingdoms presented tribute to the emperor, they were required to include white deer hides, and white deer hides were a speciality of Shanglin Park. Fisheries were equally important. Emperor Wu excavated Kunming Lake inside Shanglin Park. It was one of the largest artificial lakes in Chinese history. In its early phase, it covered about 14.2 square kilometers. Kunming Lake was far more than a landscape feature. It trained naval forces, supplied water to Chang'an, controlled floods, drained excess water, and also served as a massive aquaculture base. Historical records state that fish were raised in Kunming Lake. After fish were supplied for ritual use, all the remainder were sold in the markets of Chang'an. This was clearly commercial revenue, not merely palace consumption. The most surprising business activity concerns deer manure. Emperor Wu moved government slaves and poor people into Shanglin Park to raise deer, and collected deer droppings, charging each person 5 cash per day. Deer manure was charged by the day at 5 cash per person. By the reign of Emperor Yuan, this revenue had accumulated to 7 billion. This may be the earliest large-scale commercial operation of manure fertilizer recorded in human history. The deer manure was collected and sold. Sold to whom? To the farmers of Guangdong. Shanglin Park not only produced goods itself, it also generated cash income by selling byproducts. But the most important economic function of Shanglin Park was coin casting. In 113 BC, Emperor Wu issued an order that changed the history of Chinese currency. All commanderies and kingdoms throughout the empire were forbidden from casting coins. The right to mint coinage was brought entirely under central control and entrusted specifically to the institutions of Shanglin Park. In other words, the currency factory of the entire empire was not inside the city of Chang'an, it was inside Shanglin Park. Why put the mint inside a royal park? The answer is simple: security and control. The right to mint coinage was one of the core economic powers of the empire. It absolutely could not be allowed to fall into the hands of local forces. Placing the mint inside the imperial preserve meant that it was under the direct control of the emperor and free from interference by any local administrative system. Archaeological discoveries fully confirm the textual record. Within the Shanglin Park site, southwest of Han Chang'an, archaeologists have found multiple coin casting sites on a large scale, with large numbers of ceramic molds used to cast Wuzhou coins, including both obverse and reverse molds. This physical evidence proves that the coin workshops inside Shanglin Park were indeed producing Wuzhou coins on a large and standardized scale. The Wuzhou coin holds an extremely important place in Chinese monetary history. It was used from the reign of Emperor Wu of Han all the way to the early Tang Dynasty, circulating for more than 700 years. The source of this currency lay in the coin workshops of Shanglin Park. The economic contribution of Shanglin Park can also be seen in fiscal data. During the reign of Emperor Yuan, around 30 BC, the fiscal reserves of the Han Empire were as follows. The central treasury held 4 billion cash, and the emperor's private fiscal system held 1.8 billion. But the administrative system of Shanglin Park, separate from both of these, held 2.5 billion cash in reserve. This was cash on hand, not annual revenue. It was accumulated stock. In other words, the wealth accumulated by the Shanglin Park system even exceeded the emperor's inner treasury. More importantly, the money controlled by the water and park administration was not used only for royal consumption. Historical records clearly state that the emperor once ordered money from the Shanglin Park system to be used to build mausoleum cities, settle migrants, and construct housing. This means the wealth of Shanglin Park could be converted directly into funding for state projects. It had the function of allowing imperial household revenue to spill over into public works. Even more importantly, during the reign of Emperor Wu, Shanglin Park revenue was long used as a systematic source of rewards for powerful families moved into the mausoleum cities. Therefore, the position of Shanglin Park in the Western Han fiscal system can be summarized like this. It was not a hunting park built merely for the emperor's amusement. It was the core source of the imperial household's non-tax revenue. It was a compound, state-run estate integrating production, manufacturing, and finance. The existence of Shanglin Park shows that the difference between Chang'an and Rome was not merely a difference in area, it was a difference in economic logic. Rome was a consumer city. It depended on external inputs to keep running. Once the supply chain broke, the city faced crisis. Han Chang'an relied on a productive royal economic empire. Shanglin Park itself continuously produced grain, meat, fish, fruit, currency, and wealth. It did not depend entirely on the outside world. It was itself a supplier. This difference created two completely different models of urban survival. Rome's greatness rested on the efficiency of trans-Mediterranean logistics. Han Chang'an's stability rested on the foundation of a self-sustaining royal economy. The advantage of the former was its ability to concentrate resources on an unprecedented scale. The advantage of the latter was that it could continue to operate without depending on any external power. At this point, all three secrets have been revealed. Han Chang'an was not merely a city enclosed by walls. It was a capital region system centered on imperial power, with palaces as its core, mausoleum cities as its satellites, and Shanglin Park as its economic foundation. Around the year AD 1, the population and wealth carried by this system were in no way inferior to Rome's. In certain dimensions, they may even have surpassed it. And the reason these two models were so different lies in a deeper question. Rome and Han Chang'an served completely different political logics. Rome's power structure, at least in name, was based on popular sovereignty. The full name of the Republic was Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and people of Rome. Even in the imperial period, the emperor still had to appear as the first citizen. He had to win the support of the urban commoners through grain distributions, public works and spectacles. The more concentrated the commoners were, the more concentrated their political influence became. Therefore, Rome's spatial logic was one of inward concentration. Multi-story apartment blocks stacked vertically inside the city, and 1 million people were compressed into the 13 square kilometers within the walls. The more concentrated the people, the more stable the regime. The power structure of the Han Dynasty was completely different. The emperor's authority came from the mandate of heaven. He did not need to gain legitimacy by pleasing commoners. On the contrary, the creation of hierarchy and the maintenance of distance were necessary tools for sacralizing imperial rule. Therefore, the spatial logic of Han Chang'an was one of outward expansion. More than 2/3 of the area inside the walls was occupied by palaces. Commoners were placed in narrow residential wards, forcibly settled in distant mausoleum cities, and excluded from the royal parklands. For commoners, getting close to the Son of Heaven brought no benefit. There was no grain dole. There was no public entertainment. So the spatial pushing of commoners away from the center of power was the result of institutional design, not historical accident. These two completely different political needs shaped two completely different urban forms. Rome was a megacity compressed inward. Chang'an was a metropolitan region spread outward. Rome used trans-Mediterranean logistics to concentrate resources into a single point. Chang'an used royal estates and mausoleum satellite cities to distribute population and resources across a broader plain. So let us return to the original question. Around the year AD 1, which was the largest city in the world? In truth, this comparison has limited meaning. Rome and Han Chang'an were products of two civilizations, two political logics, and two ideas of the city. Rome's greatness lay in compressing an unprecedented population into a single urban core and sustaining it through Mediterranean maritime logistics. Han Chang'an's greatness lay in creating a multinodal metropolitan structure, supporting its population through institutional production, and pouring the sacredness of imperial power into every inch of urban space. Both models reached the peak of their respective civilizations. The reason we need to rediscover Han Chang'an today is not that Rome was not great. Rome was unquestionably one of the most outstanding cities in the history of human civilization. The reason is that our understanding of Han Chang'an has been misled for 2,000 years by a mistaken number. The number 246,000 has been cited again and again as if it represented all of Chang'an. Only with the progress of archaeology, with the discovery of settlements outside the walls, the systematic survey of Mausoleum city sites, and the renewed confirmation of the scale of Shanglin Park, have we begun to see the complete picture. These archaeological results all point to the same conclusion. Han Chang'an was not an ordinary capital city. It was a palace city, centered on imperial architecture. It was a metropolitan system centered on imperial power. It was one of the grandest royal architectural and urban complexes in the history of human civilization. In this system, the 36 square kilometers inside the walls were only the innermost boundary. The 7 mausoleum cities and Shanglin Park were its external extensions. The 2.43 million registered people of the 3 capital districts were the foundation on which it existed. In the past, people used Rome standards to measure Chang'an and concluded that Chang'an was smaller, emptier, and more backward. But Rome standards can only measure Rome itself. Eastern Chang'an, Western Rome. Around the year AD 1, these 2 cities stood together at the summit of human urban history. They followed 2 completely different roads and arrived at 2 completely different forms of greatness. And today, as archaeology deepens and the data are corrected, Han Chang'an can finally be freed from the false impression of 246,000 people. With its real scale, structure, and weight, it is returning to the map of world urban history.